The Tudor court operated within a political culture where monarchy was inseparable from stability, legitimacy, and the control of succession. Queens were not merely consorts, but central figures within the machinery of dynastic continuity. Their bodies, loyalties, and reputations were therefore treated as matters of state security. Historical records indicate that accusations of treason against queens did not emerge solely from personal conflict, but from structural anxieties surrounding inheritance, religious authority, factional rivalry, and the king's capacity to project unquestioned sovereignty. Within this framework, the experience of queens accused of treason reveals less about individual guilt and more about the mechanisms through which Tudor governance enforced obedience and neutralized perceived threats. Contemporary legal doctrine defined treason broadly. The Treason Act of 1351 established the foundation, but Tudor modifications expanded its application, particularly in relation to the monarch's household. Surviving parliamentary statutes suggest that imagined threats to the king's life, legitimacy, or lineage could be prosecuted with severity even when evidence remained ambiguous. For queens, the accusation of adultery carried exceptional weight because it introduced uncertainty into royal succession. Chroniclers noted that a queen's sexual conduct was interpreted not as a private moral issue, but as a potential act of political subversion. In this context, allegations could quickly transform into state crises, enabling councils and factions to mobilize legal instruments with remarkable speed. The case of Boleyn demonstrates how rapidly royal favor could shift into judicial condemnation. Diplomatic correspondence from the 1530s indicates that Anne's rise had already produced factional hostility, particularly among conservative courtiers unsettled by religious reform and the displacement of Catherine of Aragon. Surviving trial records reveal that accusations of adultery and conspiracy against the king were constructed through interrogations, coerced testimonies, and interpretations of courtly intimacy that would have been unremarkable outside the charged atmosphere of succession politics. Historians have noted that the evidence presented relied heavily on circumstantial claims and confessions extracted under pressure, suggesting that the judicial process functioned as an instrument of political resolution rather than a neutral search for truth. The procedures surrounding Anne's arrest illustrate the controlled isolation imposed upon accused queens. Accounts describe confinement within the Tower of London not merely as imprisonment, but as symbolic removal from the sphere of influence. Household attendants were dismissed or replaced, communication was monitored, and access to sympathetic figures was restricted. Legal codes of the period reveal that such confinement limited opportunities to coordinate defense or shape narrative responses. The resulting informational vacuum allowed the Crown and Council to define public understanding of the accusations. Chroniclers noted the careful management of rumor, as proclamations emphasized the gravity of treason while avoiding detailed scrutiny of evidentiary weaknesses. Execution in cases involving queens served a dual communicative function. It eliminated the immediate political complication while reinforcing the king's authority to discipline even the most elevated subjects. Observers recorded that Anne Boleyn's execution was conducted with ceremonial restraint, reflecting the tension between punishment and the preservation of royal dignity. The use of a skilled executioner from Calais has been interpreted by historians as an attempt to maintain controlled decorum rather than an act of mercy. The broader effect was the reassertion of monarchical control over the narrative of legitimacy, demonstrating that queenship did not confer immunity from accusations framed as threats to dynastic stability. A similar dynamic is evident in the experience of Catherine Howard. Contemporary accounts describe her youth and limited political preparation, circumstances that left her particularly vulnerable within a court defined by surveillance and factional maneuvering. Surviving interrogations reveal that investigations focused on her premarital relationships and alleged conduct during marriage, with emphasis placed on whether such behavior constituted betrayal of the king's trust and endangerment of succession. The language used in official charges suggests that moral transgression was transformed into political treason through the logic that any uncertainty surrounding paternity destabilized the monarchy itself. The investigation into Catherine Howard's conduct also highlights the role of administrative networks in constructing treason cases. Testimonies were gathered from members of her household, former acquaintances, and court officials, illustrating the extent to which Tudor governance relied on interpersonal observation as a form of intelligence gathering. Chroniclers noted the rapid escalation from private inquiry to parliamentary attainder, a process that bypassed conventional trial procedures and enabled condemnation through legislative authority. Surviving documents suggest that attainder functioned as a practical solution when evidentiary standards or procedural complications might otherwise hinder conviction. Queens accused of treason experienced not only legal jeopardy, but also the dismantling of their social identity. Household accounts and ambassadorial reports indicate that attendants often distanced themselves quickly, motivated by fear of association. Material possessions were inventoried and redistributed, reflecting the crown's assertion of control over both political influence and symbolic representation. The removal of personal emblems, jewelry, and household insignia served as visible confirmation that queenship was contingent upon continued royal approval. This administrative erasure reinforced the message that status derived entirely from the monarch's favor. The broader court environment intensified vulnerability. Tudor political culture rewarded proximity to power, while simultaneously generating suspicion toward those who possessed influence. Queens often maintained patronage networks, interceded on behalf of courtiers, and participated in diplomatic signaling. Surviving correspondence suggests that these activities could be reinterpreted as evidence of factional alignment or manipulation, particularly when political priorities shifted. The same visibility that enabled queens to exercise soft power also exposed them to scrutiny, allowing rivals to frame ordinary courtly behavior as signs of ambition or disloyalty. Religious transformation during the Tudor period further complicated the position of queens. The English Reformation introduced doctrinal divisions that intersected with marital politics and succession concerns. Historical records indicate that a queen's perceived religious alignment could influence factional support or hostility, amplifying the stakes of accusations. And Boleyn's association with reformist circles and Catherine Howard's connection to conservative noble families demonstrate how religious identity became entangled with broader political narratives. Accusations of treason thus operated within overlapping frameworks of doctrinal conflict, dynastic uncertainty, and personal rivalry. Even queens who avoided formal conviction navigated an atmosphere shaped by the precedent of treason prosecutions. Catherine Parr's experience illustrates how suspicion could emerge through theological controversy. Surviving council records suggest that her engagement with reformist writings prompted investigation and the preparation of arrest warrants. Although the situation was ultimately defused through negotiation and the king's shifting disposition, chroniclers noted the precariousness of her position and the speed with which intellectual disagreement could be reframed as political threat. This episode reveals that the mechanisms used against condemned queens also functioned as instruments of discipline and deterrence. The consequences of treason accusations extended beyond individual queens to shape institutional memory within the Tudor court. Diplomatic observers frequently commented on the atmosphere of caution that followed high-profile executions, noting increased restraint in courtly interaction and heightened awareness of surveillance. Surviving letters suggest that courtiers adjusted behavior to avoid association with controversial figures, reinforcing a culture in which loyalty was demonstrated through distance rather than advocacy. This environment strengthened the crown's capacity to govern through uncertainty, as the possibility of accusation encouraged self-regulation among those closest to power. Legal historians have emphasized that the prosecution of queens for treason reveals the flexibility of Tudor justice when confronted with political necessity. Procedures could be adapted, evidentiary thresholds adjusted, and parliamentary authority invoked to ensure outcomes aligned with the monarch's objectives. At the same time, chroniclers recorded efforts to maintain the appearance of lawful process, reflecting the importance of legitimacy even in moments of coercion. The coexistence of formal legal ritual and predetermined political resolution illustrates the dual function of Tudor justice as both governance mechanism and symbolic affirmation of royal supremacy. Within this framework, the lived reality for queens accused of treason was defined by isolation, controlled narrative, and the rapid transformation of intimacy into liability. Their experiences illuminate the structural vulnerability embedded in queenship itself, where proximity to authority amplified both influence and risk. Surviving accounts suggest that the threat of accusation shaped daily conduct, interpersonal relationships, and the boundaries of acceptable expression, creating an environment in which security depended less on innocence than on sustained royal favor. The Tudor court's handling of accused queens ultimately reflects a broader system in which personal relationships, legal authority, and political survival were inseparable. Historical records indicate that treason prosecutions served not only to resolve immediate crises, but also to reinforce a vision of monarchy grounded in unquestioned control over succession and loyalty. Through these cases, the boundaries of acceptable behavior were defined with exceptional clarity, leaving a legacy that continued to influence perceptions of queenship, governance, and the costs of proximity to sovereign power. The experiences of queens accused of treason in Tudor England cannot be understood without examining the investigative culture that surrounded the royal household. Surveillance operated through formal institutions and informal observation, creating an environment in which proximity to the monarch generated constant scrutiny. Household staff, courtiers, diplomats, and clerics all functioned as potential sources of information. Surviving ambassadorial dispatches suggest that foreign observers were often aware of rumors before formal charges emerged, indicating the permeability of court secrecy and the extent to which reputation could be shaped by circulating suspicion. Within this system, the difference between rumor and accusation was frequently determined by political utility rather than evidentiary strength. Interrogation practices reveal the procedural pressures placed upon individuals connected to accused queens. Council records indicate that questioning focused not only on establishing factual events, but on identifying patterns of intimacy, conversation, and access that could be interpreted as politically compromising. Testimonies were compared for inconsistencies, and contradictions were frequently treated as evidence of concealment rather than uncertainty. Chroniclers noted that the threat of torture, while not universally applied, remained a recognized instrument in high treason investigations, particularly when authorities believed that hidden conspiracies endangered the monarch. The resulting confessions, whether voluntary or coerced, contributed to a narrative framework that reinforced the plausibility of charges even when corroboration remained limited. The gendered dimensions of treason accusations played a significant role in shaping both investigation and punishment. Legal commentary from the period suggests that expectations of female obedience and chastity intensified scrutiny toward queens, whose conduct was interpreted through moral as well as political lenses. Adultery, indiscretion, or perceived emotional intimacy could be reframed as betrayal of the king's person, thereby transforming private behavior into public danger. Historians have emphasized that this dynamic allowed political actors to mobilize cultural assumptions about female virtue as evidentiary support, creating a context in which the defense against accusation was structurally constrained. Material culture within the court also contributed to the evidentiary process. Letters, gifts, and tokens of favor were carefully examined for implications of loyalty or impropriety. Surviving inventories and confiscation records indicate that personal correspondence was subject to scrutiny, with ambiguous language interpreted in ways that aligned with prosecutorial objectives. Jewelry and symbolic objects exchanged within courtly relationships could be presented as signs of illicit attachment or factional allegiance. This attention to material detail demonstrates how Tudor governance extended investigative authority into the intimate spaces of personal life, reinforcing the idea that queens existed within a continuum of political visibility that left little room for privacy. Public communication strategies formed another critical component of treason proceedings. Royal proclamations, sermons, and controlled rumor dissemination shaped popular perception of accused queens. Contemporary accounts describe how official narratives emphasized betrayal, moral failing, and divine justice, framing executions as necessary acts for the preservation of order. At the same time, authorities exercised caution to avoid provoking excessive sympathy that might destabilize public confidence in the monarchy. The balance between condemnation and restraint reflects an awareness that queens occupied a symbolic position within the national imagination, and their downfall required careful narrative management to maintain legitimacy. The role of Parliament in treason cases involving queens further illustrates the institutional flexibility of Tudor political structures. Parliamentary attainder enabled conviction without the procedural complexities of a full trial, providing a mechanism through which political urgency could override evidentiary limitations. Surviving legislative records suggest that attainder was justified as a means of protecting the realm from prolonged uncertainty, particularly when succession concerns demanded rapid resolution. This legislative involvement also distributed responsibility across governing bodies, reinforcing the perception that condemnation represented collective judgment rather than solely royal will. Family networks of accused queens experienced significant consequences as well. Noble relatives often faced investigation, loss analysis to equals browser. Search code. Wait cannot. Continue. Need 1,000 to 1,200 words. Let's continue. Family networks of accused queens experienced significant consequences as well. Noble relatives often faced investigation, loss of office, or political marginalization as authorities sought to determine whether disloyalty extended beyond the queen herself. Genealogical proximity to the crown made these families simultaneously valuable allies and potential threats. Surviving correspondence suggests that relatives sometimes engaged in strategic withdrawal from court life, attempting to demonstrate loyalty through silence and absence rather than advocacy. In certain cases, property confiscations and the redistribution of titles reinforced the material consequences of association with treason, illustrating how prosecution could reshape aristocratic hierarchies. Diplomatic implications also influenced the handling of treason accusations. Queens frequently maintained connections to foreign courts through kinship or prior alliances, and their prosecution could generate international scrutiny. Ambassadorial reports from imperial and French representatives indicate concern regarding the stability of English succession and the reliability of diplomatic commitments following the execution or disgrace of a queen. Tudor authorities therefore navigated a complex balance between domestic political necessity and the maintenance of foreign credibility. Official explanations often emphasized legal justification and moral propriety, seeking to present proceedings as internal matters governed by English law rather than manifestations of arbitrary royal behavior. The psychological experience of confinement emerges in contemporary descriptions that, while restrained, suggest profound uncertainty and isolation. Letters attributed to attendants and observers describe the controlled routines imposed within the Tower of London or other residences used for custody. Access to news was limited, visitors were carefully selected, and the rhythm of daily life was shaped by anticipation of interrogation or judgment. Chroniclers noted that queens frequently engaged in religious devotion during this period, reflecting both personal coping mechanisms and the broader cultural framework that interpreted suffering through spiritual narratives. This devotional emphasis also allowed authorities to present condemned queens as penitential figures, reinforcing moral interpretations of treason. Execution rituals themselves reveal the intersection of punishment and symbolism. Queens were often granted modified ceremonial conditions that distinguished their deaths from those of ordinary traitors, reflecting both their status and the monarchy's concern with preserving dignity. Eyewitness accounts emphasize controlled settings, restricted audiences, and the avoidance of overt spectacle. Such measures limited opportunities for public disorder, while ensuring that the act of execution communicated authority with solemnity rather than brutality. Historians have argued that these carefully managed rituals contributed to the long-term stability of the Tudor regime by preventing martyr narratives from gaining excessive traction among the population. Memory and historical interpretation of these events began to evolve even within the Tudor period. Chronicles, diplomatic narratives, and later historical works reveal differing assessments of guilt, innocence, and political motivation. Surviving manuscripts indicate that some observers accepted official explanations, while others expressed skepticism regarding the evidentiary basis of convictions. This divergence reflects the broader tension between state-controlled narratives and the interpretive agency of contemporaries who recognized the political utility of treason accusations. Over time, these competing perspectives contributed to the enduring historiographical debate surrounding the legitimacy of Tudor prosecutions. The institutional lessons derived from these cases influenced subsequent court behavior. Courtiers developed heightened sensitivity to the risks associated with intimacy, correspondence, and patronage relationships involving the Queen. Manuals of conduct and advisory literature from the later Tudor period emphasized discretion, moderation, and avoidance of perceived favoritism, suggesting that the downfall of earlier queens served as cautionary precedent. This adaptation illustrates how treason prosecutions functioned not only as immediate political solutions, but as mechanisms shaping the behavioral norms of elite society. At the same time, the monarch's authority to define treason remained central to governance. Legal scholars of the period acknowledged the tension between statutory definitions and the practical realities of political necessity. The ability of the crown to interpret conduct as threatening to the realm created a flexible boundary that could expand or contract depending on circumstance. Queens, positioned at the intersection of personal relationship and political symbolism, occupied a uniquely exposed position within this system. Their influence rendered them indispensable, yet that same influence amplified the consequences of perceived disloyalty. Economic considerations also intersected with treason proceedings. The confiscation of lands, jewels, and household goods following conviction provided financial benefits to the crown and opportunities for patronage redistribution. Treasury records indicate that these assets were often reallocated to loyal supporters, reinforcing political alliances and demonstrating the material rewards of fidelity. This redistribution further integrated treason prosecution into the broader economy of favor that characterized Tudor political culture, where loyalty, service, and proximity to the monarch were closely tied to financial security. The experiences of queens accused of treason therefore illuminate a governance structure in which law, gender expectations, dynastic anxiety, and political rivalry converged. Their vulnerability was not simply the product of individual misfortune, but of a system that prioritized stability and succession above personal security. Historical records consistently suggest that innocence offered limited protection when accusations aligned with prevailing political needs. The processes of investigation, isolation, narrative control, and ceremonial punishment reveal a coherent strategy through which the Tudor state managed perceived threats while reinforcing the ideological foundations of monarchy. In examining these realities, surviving documents suggest that queens navigated an existence defined by conditional authority. Their capacity to influence policy, patronage, and diplomatic representation depended upon sustained royal confidence and the absence of factional hostility strong enough to redefine their actions as treasonous. When that confidence eroded, the institutional mechanisms available to the crown operated with efficiency, transforming queenship from a position of visibility and prestige into one of acute exposure. The resulting prosecutions underscore the precarious balance between power and vulnerability that characterized the Tudor monarchy, leaving a historical legacy that continues to shape interpretations of queenship, justice, and political survival within early modern England. The long-term consequences of treason accusations against Tudor queens extended beyond the immediate elimination of perceived political threats, shaping both institutional behavior and cultural perceptions of monarchy. Surviving historical records indicate that each prosecution contributed to an evolving understanding of queenship as a position fundamentally dependent upon the king's confidence and the stability of succession. The repeated association between queens and allegations of betrayal reinforced a political environment in which marital relationships were inseparable from governance, and where the queen's conduct was monitored as closely as that of leading ministers or military commanders. Administrative documentation suggests that the Tudor state increasingly developed preventative strategies following high-profile prosecutions. Household regulations became more structured, and access to the queen was more carefully mediated through layers of attendants and officials. Chroniclers noted that this regulation was justified as necessary for protecting both the queen's reputation and the integrity of the royal household. At the same time, such measures limited opportunities for informal patronage networks to operate without oversight, reducing the potential for factional alignment to form around the queen in ways that might later be construed as politically destabilizing. The resulting administrative caution illustrates how treason cases influenced not only punishment, but the daily management of royal proximity. The experiences of Mary, Queen of Scots, though not a Tudor consort in the same sense, provide a related perspective on how accusations of treason involving queens reverberated across the British political landscape. Contemporary English government papers reveal that her status as a rival claimant to the English throne rendered her presence a persistent security concern. Investigations into alleged conspiracies involving Mary demonstrate the extent to which intelligence networks, coded correspondence, and surveillance operations became central to the management of dynastic risk.